Wonderful. Thanks, Marion. Thank you, Hassan. So it's my pleasure to welcome our first keynote speaker of the conference this morning, Dr. Susan Porter. Dr. Susan Porter is the Dean and Vice Provost of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies at the University of British Columbia. She is also the past president of the Canadian Association for Graduate Studies, which we all lovingly know as CAGS, and a clinical professor in pathology and laboratory medicine at UBC. She studied under Michael Smith for her PhD in biochemistry at UBC and with Beatrice Mintz at the Fox Chase Cancer Center from 1989 to 1991 before returning to UBC. Dr. Porter's early research focused on higher order gene regulation and later on molecular-based testing for clinical microbiology. She has also served in successive graduate administration roles at UBC since 2000 in the faculties of medicine and graduate studies. She was appointed Dean and Vice Provost in 2013 and was elected President of CAGS in 2017. Throughout her administrative career, Dr. Porter has had a strong focus on the preparation of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows to thrive and contribute meaningfully through their work after graduation or fellowship completion. Gradually understanding that the current paradigm of doctoral education is still not optimally meeting the needs of either students or the realities of the 21st century world, Dr. Porter has been making a concerted effort over the past 5 years towards a rethinking of the core of doctoral education. Students' research, their dissertations, and the ways in which they learn and are mentored. At UBC, she has been leading a Reimagining the PhD conversation and a series of initiatives, most notably a multiple award-winning experiment, the Public Scholars Initiative, that is demonstrating the immense value and legitimacy of broadening doctoral research that fosters students' holistic development to better address today's urgent needs. She has also co-led a national CAGS task force on this subject and is working to further the conversation and to provide support and resources to the graduate committee across Canada and beyond. Dr. Porter will speak to us this morning about the formation of scholars for the 21st century, and it is my pleasure and honor to pass over to Dr. Porter this morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter, for joining us.
Many thanks, Veronica, for that very kind introduction. Let me just see if I can share my screen here. I think this is the best way to do it. Does that look okay? Just going to minimize this. Okay. Whoops. Am I showing the screen okay?
Not yet.
Oh. That's interesting. It seems to be.
There we go.
Well,
yes.
But it's the wrong, is it the right?
It looks like the right one to me.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay. It's all new. Yes, so thanks very much for that lovely introduction. I'm coming today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, otherwise known as Vancouver. As Veronica mentioned, I'm a molecular biologist by training, and so I feel a little bit of a fraud in this wonderful conference, but I also am a practitioner of graduate administration for 20 years, as she mentioned, and I truly have a passion for nurturing the next generation of scholars. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I congratulate you on this conference. It looks completely wonderful and extremely important, so well done on that. So I'm going to start off. I'll be talking a lot about both the background to this, which is and what we've done at UBC, as well as what we've done at CAGS. So I want to talk about the origin of the words I'm using, and they were stolen. They're not my words. And so they came from a book that was very influential to me and for others, The Formation of Scholars, which was a Carnegie initiative of the doctorate book in 2008. And they particularly use the words with great care. So formation was not training, was not education, but it was the nurturing of the whole person, the whole doctoral student. So not only did the development of the intellectual expertise, but the growth of the personality, the character, the habits of heart, and the habits of mind, which is a huge thing to take ownership of, and the scholar's professional identity. I'll come back to the idea of this holistic need later. And the word scholar was carefully chosen as well. And it is not a scholar in the traditional sense of someone who works in academia, but as they said, these are thinkers and actors, intellectual adventures and moral agents. So the graduates do scholarship, whether in the academy or outside the academy. They are doing scholarship and they're using their knowledge and skill. Of course, one hopes with integrity, responsibility, and generosity. So what about the 21st century? Well, I often talk about Daniel Coit Gilman, who was the first president of Johns Hopkins, and he played a pivotal role in the revolutionization of higher education in the United States, and was the first to regularize PhD requirements in the US and then really kind of adopted in Canada mostly. He adopted and adapted the German grad school concept to the American context. And he realized the necessity of scholarly inquirement for the advancement of society, but also warned of the dangers of too narrow a specialization. And the risk of having graduates, sorry, I meant to put this quote, the risk of graduates who somehow had lost touch with the society in which they were to be serving. So he felt strongly that it is said that he promulgated the concept of the protean PhD. In other words, a PhD is not static. It must change according to the world that's happening around it. So it should change forms, it should be adaptable, it should be versatile. And he said that every epoch requires a fresh start, and that's what we have taken to heart. So what are the epochal changes? Just to say that it is in fact changing, and it has been changing since its inception. So when disciplines took hold in the academy, of course, we saw increased specialization. In the 1950s, post-war, research funding skyrocketed, and in the sciences, increasing lab research, and that's where it became very strongly, at least in the sciences, very strongly linked the student and faculty research, the cheap labor, so to speak. More applied subjects began developing in the 1970s. Academic jobs began to decrease, so we started seeing, oh, okay, that was when we started thinking about, okay, what should our doctorate students, how should they be educated considering they're not going to the academy? It's taken quite a while for us to figure that one out. And of course, after the 80s, it became more and more realized that careers are changing, and that we really, not just because of the careers, but because of the world, we really need to change our ideas of scholarship. So the new subjects, interdisciplinarity, really took root, or at least the wording of it. And in doctoral education, we started introducing professional development, extracurricular, I'll point out extracurricular. Manuscript theses was the little change in at least the sciences, and things like internships and expanded conceptions of scholarship. And these are the terms that Ernest Boyer used in the 1980s of application, discovery, integration, and teaching and learning, that were all forms of scholarship and all critical for the vitality of the academy. And so we are now finding ourselves in the 21st century, and I will use a term that, again, I stole, post-normal times, and I'll just talk about why I think that's a helpful term to think about. So it's a term that was originally coined in the 1990s from Funtowitz and Ravetz, who talked about post-normal science, or science for the post-normal age, and which is different from postmodern. So normal in this sense is the sort of what I would call fundamental enlightenment view of knowledge and of scholarship, of thinking, and the fact that it doesn't work anymore. By the way, Ziauddin Sadar in 2010 expanded the term and the thinking beyond just science, but actually the age in general. So these are some key characteristics of what we mean by post-normal. They're interconnectedness of our world, the complexity, chaos, contradictions, volatility, uncertainty, and ambiguity. You've probably heard the term VUCA. This is very much overlapping with that. And I'm just gonna, just a couple of illustrations. Think of the COVID pandemic. Think about how interconnected and complex that has been. We live in a complex adaptive system where things affect other things in ways that we can't imagine. If we think about our likelihood of being infected, that depends on infrastructure, depends on business, depends on technology, human behavior, biology, environment, social structures. They are all connected. They're all influencing parts of the system. What happens in India affects whether or not we have the virus here. How people view market economy affects whether we have the virus. Incredibly complex and interconnected. Of course, our wildfires now that we're all experiencing firsthand, and the related climate change that is exacerbating it, affected by technology, affected by human behavior and values, economics, education. They're all connected and they all influence that. And we can't possibly understand the issues without understanding these connectivities. We can't address them without considering these interconnectivities. Uncertainty and ambiguity. Well, we certainly feel that every single day. The world isn't predictable, or at least entirely predictable, no matter what models people use. There's just too many variables for certainty, and we have to get our head around that. And we do as human beings to lesser or greater degrees. We don't always do that very well. Contradictions, irreconcilable views and perspectives. I think we're seeing that more and more, and it's distressing, I know, for all of us. These aren't going to be resolved or eliminated, but hopefully transcended. So contradictory values and understanding. Should we prioritize the economy or safety? Is climate change a hoax or is it real? I mean, I know the answer to that, but these are irreconcilable views that we have to live with, and that's a very hard thing. And so these are the ways they see as approaching these interconnectivities and uncertainties. We can't continue on with the reductionist analytical worldview, which just takes little bits and looks at it. That is not going to be the answer to these problems. It's not going to be the understanding to these problems either. So they talk about a systemic. We see it as in systems. We synthesize across. It's a humanistic. And critically, there needs to be a plurality of legitimate perspectives. We can't do it from a single perspective. We can't address it. We can't understand it from a single perspective. It has to be multiple. So it cannot be resolved by old-fashioned, normal binary logic, true, false. It needs a higher form. And they use the term post-formal reasoning, which I think was a very helpful concept for me. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. So if we consider ourselves in post-normal times, and I should say that post-normal is a description of both what is and what maybe perhaps should be. So there's a little bit of both in here. So we've talked about interconnectedness and interdependence. It's just been a massive increase in the past few decades. In terms of knowledge creation and mobilization, again, this is a oversimplified, I completely acknowledge, but that sort of a sentiment was that we needed to reduce reductive approaches, decontextualize it, taken out of context. And for knowledge mobilization, it had tended to be linear. We discover something, we implement it. And that was also called mode 1 knowledge mobilization by McGibbons and others. So as we move into post-normal times, we need more holistic, and we are getting more holistic, contextualized research. In other words, research that is happening at the core of the problem, an iterative back and forth. So that's more like mode 2. Our problems, as mentioned, and I'm sure by coming to this conference, you all agree, it can't possibly be approached by single disciplinary lenses. Conceptions of knowledge, we're moving beyond the ideas of certainty, binary, hierarchical, and we're looking at uncertainty. We're looking at multiple legitimate ways of knowing, and it's also been called ecology of knowledges. We also know, and Rel Rhodes is of course an exemplar of this, that the role of a university in society is changing from an ivory tower to engaged. I think the word engaged is pretty much in every university strategic plan that I'm aware of. Experts, the concept of experts is changing from just academics now to community members, to patients, to practitioners, as well as academics. Employers, of course, are going everywhere, are everywhere. Careers, you know, it used to be once in a lifetime and it was a job that you had. Now, you know, our graduates will be doing many, they say at least 5 different careers in a lifetime, and it's more portfolio based rather than job description based. Communication modes. When I was a graduate student, I learned how to write a scholarly paper, done and done. That's all I had to do. Well, our scholars in the world will be doing many different types of communication. They'll be using and disseminating the knowledge in many different ways. The work that they'll be doing, the scholarly work, when one thinks of it as a very broad term of scholar, some will be doing disciplinary, but they'll be doing transdisciplinary. They'll be doing all these different types of scholarly approaches. And I'm bringing in well-being here because I think this is intimately connected to this, and I'll maybe allude to that later. So it hasn't really been on radar, but it hasn't really been on radar until the last few years, and it's definitely a key thing to attend to as graduate educators. And then identity I think it's also something that hasn't really been looked at sufficiently. So when I was a graduate student, I wanted to be an academic. I was a fish in fish and water. It was fine. Everyone else wanted me to be that. I was being mentored in that way. But now, even students come in with different identities and have visions of their life after graduate school that is very different from the environment that they're in. They want to be analysts. They want to be change agents. They want to be leaders and innovators and experts and communicators. Those are, the professional identity in all its dimensions. That's a very broad category. And I would say we're not doing the best job in supporting those different identities. So this is a way of thinking about post-normal times, and particularly, as I mentioned before, the concept of post-formal thinking. So formal thinking was the highest level of thinking that Jean Piaget theorized in adult cognition, and it was abstract, binary logic. It was hypothetical deductive. It was scientific method, analytical reductive, and you know where I'm coming from with this. Those are fantastic attributes to look at defined problems. They're very effective at that. But ill-defined problems, they're insufficient. And so John Sinnott and others coined the term post-formal thinking, which is beyond, above the formal thinking. And it allows one to go from abstract to the practical. It involves multiple logics, not just binary, multiple perspectives. Whoops. It tolerates conflict and ambiguity and paradox and uses that. It accepts uncertainty of knowledge, the realization there's no single solution. It is synthetic. It gathers, it integrates. It involves lateral thinking. It involves creative thinking. It involves system thinking. So these are very different and challenging than what we've necessarily been taught. A quote that I think is nice is Judith Stevens Long, who talked about this, and she said, it is a higher order of consciousness that involve changes in epistemology and ways of making meaning more inclusive, integrated, and complex. So in terms of attributes for graduate students, again, I've gone back to that holistic view of the formation rather than training. And I've been using the medicine, the Indigenous medicine wheel here as just a way of showing the interconnectedness of all aspects of our being. So our body, mind, spirit, and emotions. So this is my attempt at sort of trying to integrate the various ways of being with this medicine wheel. But we of course need intellectual attributes. We've talked about those, being able to integrate perspectives and make connections, to see the big picture, to understand context, to think laterally and creatively and systems-wide. We need a humility of spirit. We have to understand our limitations. That's so essential. We have to be aware of and motivated to seek diverse perspectives. We sometimes talk about skills, and that's fine, but we have to inherently in our being want to do that. You have to be morally committed. Wisdom, I think, covers this quite well as well. And of course, be aware of our own selves, self-reflective. We need to be able to elicit change. So things like design thinking, practical problem solving. Now those are, post-formal abductive reasoning. In terms of there's a strong emotional component to all this as well. So we need to be empathic, be able to enter into each other's ways of being and knowing. We have to be resilient and adaptable, and gain things like tacit understanding. So I've just put a few quotes here from some good thinkers in the world who have been talking about what we need, what COVID has taught us, and what we need post-pandemic. And I think you'll see how I've highlighted things that I've been talking about. And I think it's really, truly more important than ever that as we learn from the complexity of the pandemic, we make changes in our ways of thinking and doing. So what about doctoral formation? I would suggest that we need to be able to, students need to be able to ask questions from different perspectives. And we'll go into that. Collaborating across silos. Mobilizing knowledge with and for stakeholders. So things like policy, organizational change, communication, entrepreneurship, commercial or creative projects, consulting, all of these are ways in which one uses knowledge in the world. Yet, traditionally in the academy, we not only have not encouraged the education around that and the practice around that, but we've often prohibited, unbelievably prohibited students from including those key essential modes of doing scholarship in their research and dissertation. It's really quite astounding. Forms of knowing, thinking and system, I'm talking about it, integration of forms of knowing. I loved, I'm sure many people have read it, but I loved the Robin Wall Kimmerer book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and she talked about a tree being a she instead of an it. Think about, imagine how our world would be different if we saw nature and ourselves as interdependent subjects rather than as an object and commodity. Think about how that would change us. Designing solutions. So again, synthetic and abductive thinking, embracing those forms of scholarship. And these are, I would say, so critically important that they need to be integral to the deepest intellectual way of being a scholarship and doing scholarship. It's not something you learn on a workshop on a Friday afternoon. This has to be integral to how you think about and do scholarship. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at UBC since about 2014. So we've been promoting this and supporting broadened forms of scholarship, and partly that's been through the Public Scholars Initiative, which I'll touch on. We've broadened what our policy is around dissertation content and format. We've changed the letter that goes out to external examiners telling about our values and about the breadth of scholarship that they can expect in dissertations. We have broadened what's acceptable on a supervisory and examining committee, and we need to do more to promote that, but we've we've accepted that broadening. We've implemented a publicly engaged interdisciplinary course, which I should say the faculty are unbelievably excited about, and I was surprised at that, and they just love that. And then related professional development around the kinds of things that they need to learn how to do. And then there's two other things, transdisciplinary collaborative PhD and concurrent credentials that we're working on. So Public Scholars Initiative is, we use the term or the definition from Imagining America, which is mutually beneficial partnerships of university knowledge and resources with those of the public and private sectors to contribute to the public good. It's very generic, but I think it's helpful. And so this is a program to help students who wish to extend and mobilize their research beyond traditional approaches to collaborate, especially with non-academic partners, and to create a tangible public good. So we provide funding, and this goes all across all disciplines across the university. We have networking events. We have this thing called PhDs Go Public, where they have to present their research to the public, professional development, online profiles, academic support, and community. So the goal is to be able to work in diverse contexts and in a scholarly and effective way, to be able to approach messy and ill-defined problems, to gain flexibility in epistemological and rhetoric. Diverse forms of scholarly products have been promoted, things like policy papers, curriculum, and then gain experience of potential career pathways, and that's always been a goal. So we want for the university and the public to contribute, obviously, to the public good, but we also want to be seen, and I think I probably don't have to explain why that's important. We want to enhance the legitimacy of different forms, reputation of the PhD, and I probably don't need to explain why that's a goal. And of course, we want to increase the impact and validity of research. So we've had more than 250 students so far. Most of them have had partners outside the university, and we've had over 85 defended dissertations. I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples, and I will not do justice to these because they're not my field, but I just am so inspired by them. Sarah Monroe in Interdisciplinary Studies looked at vaginal births after cesareans and why there seemed to be too many, and what were the factors that contributed to these. Not enough vaginal births. People were doing cesarean after cesarean, which weren't necessary. So she could have done a straightforward analysis, but she actually wanted to change it. So she, after her primary analysis, which was involving multiple stakeholders, she actually interpreted the differing perspectives, the differing needs, values, instincts, knowledge bases, as a complex adaptive systems. And she worked with those stakeholders to actually create a policy paper. So it would be integrated knowledge translation. And what's wonderful is that policy has actually been implemented in a health authority in which she worked with. Greg from anthropology worked on Russian emigration, and his was fascinating because he did it in three. His dissertation was in three distinct forces: autobiographical, autoethnographic, and a sort of a traditional objective academic. All of these were held in relation to an art installation that he did. He is an artist, and which was installed in various cities around the world. His external examiner called it remarkable, polyphonic, like nothing I have encountered before. And I'll just read what he said because it speaks to the different ways of knowing. By the end of the thesis, we cannot say we have a summary of facts or conclusion about the meaning of emigration, rather a feel for the ways in which immigrants set out their lives and a taste of how Russians at home respond. So there's a richness that can't be provided by simply words. And then Jessica Hellenbach, which I can't do justice to. It's a fascinating dissertation. These are all, by the way, on our university website dissertations. She looked at Indigenous women and their history in relationship, particularly to colonial archiving practice, which is involved, of course, exclusion, and their relationship to fishing and water. She worked particularly alongside one Indigenous woman who was a former fisherman, and the history, and she worked with her to develop methodologies to sort of uncover the history and relationship she and others had with fish and the sea and with family. And a substantial part was her helping her find the story of her collaborators' great-grandmothers and to connect her with the family that she had lost. And so one chapter was a documentary film that she co-produced with her partner. And they also produced a paper, which was a narrative. And it was just a beautiful way of expressing and an Indigenous way of knowing about some very important topics. So all of these, and I would say what we aim for all of PSI is a plurality of approaches, perspectives, ways of knowing, and so on. And then in other products, other dissertations besides the three I've talked about here, there's an essay in botany. Now that doesn't sound that strange for social sciences. Botany, it's very unusual. SOTL research, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning research, was a chapter in several dissertations. Film, public reports, a resource for industry, tools for decision makers in Comp Sci. One of the interdisciplinary dissertations was a choose your path. So you could go different parts depending on how you wanted to read the dissertation. There was poetry, there was a single combined voice. And then I put these in italics because they weren't through the PSI, but they were separate. One was in a completely Indigenous oral tradition, no punctuation, and one was a comic book, both of which received very strong endorsements. So we have done, this is a little bit old, but we haven't updated this, but vast majority of scholars have said the experience has significantly impacted their formation identity, and it was important for their career paths as well. Not all supervisors are supportive. So sometimes we had students that were keen to change their dissertation, but their supervisors were not. So and what was wonderful to hear was about how they changed their thinking about their own research, how they changed thinking about research in general, and how they thought about themselves as scholars. And that was perhaps the most surprising, that so many of them, that's not surprising, but so many of them truly wanted to make a difference in the world, were passionate to make a difference, but they did not see a way to do it otherwise. And so many were told to leave their expertise and their ambitions at the door. That's not what we do in the academy. I think that's changing, but that's what many have experienced. And so many felt a massive relief that their identities were affirmed, that they had found their home. And interestingly, many said that they wanted to go into academia after all, because they realized there was a place for them in the academy. So now I'll get to the tags, and I'm sorry I took this long to get here, but the CAGS Task Force on the Dissertation. So this is a co-led with Lisa Young. It was a 2-year cross-Canada consultation. We wanted to see what the sentiment was out there more broadly around some of these issues. So we didn't suggest altering the core function of a dissertation, which we said, and probably most universities have something like this on their website describing it. An original communicates an original and significant contribution to knowledge. So our questions were, does it have to be unified? Does it have to be a single theme throughout? What is acceptable? What is original? What is new knowledge? What are acceptable forms of communication? What are the criteria for which we include or assess them? What are the concerns, and what should we be recommending? So we did a 2-year consultation across the country with people doing it in groups or of various sizes, and across, to some extent, across geographies as well. So we found a grayscale, I would say. At the one end, no, don't change it. And I think if we did the same thing here today, so this was 3 years ago, I think we'd find it changing. But at the time, there was a fair number that said, no, this is not right. A lot of them said, let's do this, or we're doing it already. And then there were, I think probably most were saying, maybe. And I would say most of them were in that sort of more towards the let's do it, but still hesitant. And at the far end of let's change things, it was definitely more students felt that, and then graduate deans felt that, and then disciplinary faculty were least likely to be enthusiastic about that, which is perhaps not overly surprising. So we would say they were excited but nervous. So why were they nervous? The risk of losing depth. What do we do about the apprentice paradigm, at least in the sciences? How do we help students, or how do we allow students even to do things that are outside their faculty members' grants? Mentorship, how do we mentor and assess them if we don't really know as faculty members how to do this? There's a risk to students. A lot of people thought they wouldn't get jobs, they wouldn't get scholarships. And that has, I should say, that is definitely not borne out in the PSI students. And then just that's not how it's done, and the concept of dumbing down the PhD. Why were they excited? Breadth is fantastic. Creativity seems to be really valued and increased. Often when one uses knowledge, when one mobilizes it, validates it, and sometimes you even understand it better. Often you understand the knowledge better when it's validated or applied. Expands a privileged way of knowing. And of course, it's relevant to the world and to careers. So our recommendations were to encourage broadening. This is a quote from the CGS paper that they wrote a few years ago, to move towards a perspective of actual anticipated needs of the student, the workplace, and society, echoing Daniel Coit-Gilman. Continue to also value traditional basic research. We heard that loud and clear. To encourage expansion of mentors and supervisory committee members as appropriate. To consider a single dissertation. If you feel you can't do the entire dissertation differently, maybe consider a single chapter that differs. Provide learning support and opportunities. These are sometimes things that aren't already taught in the academy. To modify policies as necessary, and to recognize, of course, alt scholarship and faculty reward systems in hiring, because you can't expect students to be doing this if faculty aren't also rewarded for it. Keep talking was an important part of it. And we use this quote from Yehuda Elkanah from 2006. We have to rethink the faculty. We can't just rethink the doctorate on its own. So at CAGS, we went forward and we created a whole website on rethinking the PhD, and that includes a bunch of resources on the topic, as well as a studio of broadened dissertations and interviews with the students who have done those. And then last year, or 2 years ago, we did a survey of just a somewhat semi-random array of doctoral granting institutions to see where we were since the report was launched. We had 24 responses. In terms of opinion, what is the perspective of those graduate deans in the 24 institutions? Almost all agreed, very much so. Are they doing anything? There's a number that have started to do things. They would like to. Some of them have not yet done anything. Some don't really see it as the role of the graduate school, to be honest, which I disagree with, but that's understandable. So they've, across Canada, people have revised regulations, they've had conversations. Sometimes individual grad programs have been created or modified to meet these kinds of values, and then some have provided funding. So what's next at UBC? We're continuing the conversation, particularly understanding the barriers for people. We're collaborating with other institutions. We're actually promoting broadened supervisory committees. We're in the process of that, including Indigenous elders and other relevant people that really need to participate in the mentoring of students. We're not doing this directly, but we're promoting faculty reward criteria, tenure and promotion. And then we feel the strong need to look at concurrent offerings of credentials. So things like around policy, around knowledge mobilization, design thinking, data indigeneity, and some of these are happening, and we will continue to support those that are. And then another one is the collaborative PhD, and this is just, I'm just doing a theoretical one. We actually have one collaborative PhD that's already, it's already happening. It's got funding, and they're just setting it up and figuring it out. That's on a low carbon future. But this is the one we kind of, to start the conversations off, this is one of the ones we use to help people think through what we meant by this. So if you think about child malnutrition in the developing world, that's so multifactorial, correctly. It's the classic post-normal problem. There's low literacy, there's nutrient limitations, there's historical power structures, there's altered gut microbiomes, and so on and so forth. And so these are all relevant to different, very different disciplines and graduate program types. But they all intersect. They're all important. And we're getting back to the systems, adaptive systems. We can't really address it without considering these various forms. And so the idea of helping students to figure, I mean, this is incredibly difficult to collaborate across these diverse disciplines. It's very uncommon in some disciplines to have collaborative work in the sciences, for example, but it's not usually to the extent that we're talking about here. It is, yeah, and if we're considering it as transdisciplinary, we also would want external partners as well, governments, communities, NGOs. So when I talk about this, and so the idea is not just that they would collaborate in the research, but they would actually collaborate in the dissertation itself. So we anticipate that at least a core of the dissertations would be collaboratively written. So that might be a framing of the questions, for example, and there may be some that would be some, but not all of the disciplines together. We're not sure how it's going to turn out, but those are the ideas. And there's really a spectrum for what it could look like. But I can say that there's a lot of interest. There's at least, as I said, one group is funded, and there's at least 3 other groups that are really interested in exploring this. And whenever I talk about this with students, without exception, they are so excited, almost in tears, some of them. So I'm pretty excited about this. We'll see how it goes. So I just want to end with my gratitude for visionaries such as Daniel Coit-Gilman for the support of our universities in Santa Ono, and for the enthusiasm and passion that I see every day in students. That's so uplifting and encouraging for me. These are some references, and that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porter. Such a lot to reflect on, and such a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for Q&A. 10:25, we will break. So with this 10 minutes, I'll open the floor for questions. I invite participants, please, to grab mic and engage with Susan directly. I do have a question myself, but I will open the floor for others. Okay, I see here Rob raise his hand. There you go, Rob.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on being on camera, so apologize for the very casual. Thank you very much, Dr. Porter. My question is the reception, maybe at UBC amongst, say, traditional scholars, those who were trained in the normal times, as you framed it, to some of the changes you're proposing or pushing for. So how is this being received amongst maybe more senior faculty members who have gone through the process in a much more ivory tower type of approach?
Thanks for that question. It's not divided equally between senior and junior. I think there's a spectrum. Some junior are very traditional, and some senior are very open. You know, it's variable, and I can't say I can't speak for on behalf of of course the entire faculty. Some are so completely enthusiastic, and some are just, I would say, some just you know, like they don't see the importance. They're not necessarily completely opposed. And the kinds of reactions that I mentioned in our CAGS dissertation, we see at UBC as well. So, well, you know, that's not what we do. It's dumbing it down to put that stuff in. And I still struggle a lot with the scholars that are doing really good knowledge translation, and it's relegated to an appendix or one sentence at the end of their dissertation. I thought but it's so important. And it is not given front and center. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but it's really variable from people that are wildly enthusiastic and people that are like, no. But I think over the years, I think I'm perhaps seeing less of the negativity, but that's just a perception. Maybe it's my own rose-colored glasses.
Well, I see here Connie also raised her hand. Please go ahead, Connie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. I really enjoyed your presentation on so many levels. I'm wondering if you would be able to speak a bit about that concept of just having that one chapter within a larger dissertation. And also, when there was the movement in educational research from quantitative to qualitative and interpretive and qualitative research, there used to be, you know, a whole justification as to why that was acceptable. And over the years, that justification and rationale has been dropped out of the dissertation because it's well accepted now. So do you see this post-normal transdisciplinary dissertation work in that same vein, where there has to be like a rationale as to why they are approaching it this way? Or is it the assumption that it is green lights to just begin from that?
That's an interesting question. I think there's a variety, and it's somewhat dependent on the discipline. So we've had I think I'm seeing, I mean, it depends. So it depends who is the examiner for the dissertation, right? If they come from a place that is, they are already open, they are already doing that, then arguably there's less need to try to explain it. Sometimes there is a need, and some folks would say, well, we shouldn't have to explain this. This is scholarly, and I shouldn't have to do this. But in general, we do advise students to, if they're really going outside the norm, they should probably give some background and justification for it. Not, maybe that's a strong word, justification, but they should describe how they're approaching it and why that's a valid way. So we've only really, as far as I know, we've only really had one external examiner that was really not impressed with the diversity of this, what the students were doing. And that was unfortunate. I feel very badly for the student. But honestly, for the others, they've generally been very supportive and very enthusiastic, and they felt they were able to assess it on its merit and were not sort of blown away, not knowing how. One of the things I'm sort of rambling here, but one of the things we're thinking about is, for example, people that do documentary films or do art installations, it's hard to find an examiner that would be both an expert in the field and an expert on the quality of that art installation. So, I mean, that's always been a problem in interdisciplinarity, but we're thinking of perhaps having what we call assessors. So these would be folks that could able to assess, for example, that art installation and talk about the qualities of it and the how well it's done and the skill involved and so on. And they wouldn't necessarily be from the academy, and they wouldn't necessarily have a vote in whether the student passes or not, but they could provide some expert advice on it. So that's one way we're thinking about covering those areas that are outside some academic disciplines. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Susan, I'm just I would like to draw your attention. There is a question in the chat from Vanessa. Vanessa, do you want to say your question, or do you want us to read the question on your behalf?
Oh, I could. You can hear me, it looks like.
Yes.
Very quickly, what the question was, thank you so much, Dr. Porter. That was a very interesting presentation. I was curious about these transdisciplinary PhDs and whether they are primarily being supported through some kind of funding award that has been like a 5-year funding award, or if they are being supported within a program or institutionally.
That's a great question. We're still figuring this out. So the very first one I mentioned is about low carbon future, and they are being funded through an internal grant on the climate emergency. We see this as a spectrum of there's not necessarily one way to do this. This is a spectrum, and we're already doing it in many ways. So I don't think it's absolutely necessary that they have special funding. Graduate students at UBC are funded anyway. And so it doesn't necessarily require, I think it helps to have funding, and we will be looking at, sort of development work and things like that to try and raise money for this. But it is, so at this point, there's only one, and it has been funded, but the others are looking at it, and they may not necessarily require additional funding, depending on what they're doing.
Thanks. And I see a question from Deborah. Deborah, correct? Yes.
Yes,
Go ahead,
that's
Deborah.
correct. Thank you. Deborah Hoven from Athabasca University. Thank you very much, Susan, for that enlightening and empowering presentation. I'd just like to touch on perhaps one suggestion, throw it out there, and also come back to your the question earlier from my colleague Connie and your response to that, and then the previous question by Vanessa. So I'm wondering if there's a possibility, when you're talking about assessing diverse approaches to dissertations, whether we can start exploring having more than one external examiner, having a collaborative dialogue among the committee and the examiners about what proportion is allocated to what components. And coming back to some of your earlier comments in your presentation, I mean, creativity, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, it incorporates cognition, emotions, the affective side of our being, the spiritual sides of our being. So why not have that holistic approach to examining and creativity, because creativity encompasses so many parts of our being. What I encourage my students to do when they are considering or approaching, and I have had a few diverse or transdisciplinary dissertations, is to write a positioning or positionality prologue, and then refer back to that when they're discussing their methodological approach, or their approach to how they decided to structure their investigation, if we like to use traditional terminology here. And I know that some of my other colleagues, Pamela Walsh and Cindy Ives and Beth Perry, will be talking about some diversity in that respect too. So that was just throwing it out there, sort of proposal for discussion. I'm sure you've probably considered it or thought of it.
if I understood thanks very much. If I understood your question, should we have multiple examiners and should there be a more of a dialogue amongst them? Is that kind of, yeah. Well, in fact, that's what does happen. We have about 4 internal examiners in the university and 1 external, and especially now with COVID and Zoom, the external is often there virtually. And so there often is kind of an interchange. So I would say that does happen. And as I mentioned, we're also talking about maybe having someone from outside the academy that would participate in that as well.
As we do with Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, yeah.
Yes, yes. And the other thing you mentioned, oh yes, the positionality, yes, I think it depends. Yes, our students, I think, would normally do that if it's called for in their type of scholarship. So I would say that's pretty normal. It depends on what the work is, of course. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a great way of looking at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's 10:27 and we already 2 minutes.
I'm sorry. Daku, I see. I think she had her hand up earlier, so I would.
Correct. Yeah.
Be nice to have her. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Foster, for your talk. It was indeed very eye-opening. And when you were talking about normal times and post-normal times, you talked about a shift to portfolio-based career. So could you elaborate more on what that means?
Sorry, I missed that one word.
Yeah, you talked about
Yeah.
portfolio-based career in post-normal times. So could you elaborate more on what the portfolio-based career means?
Portfolio, okay, yes. So it's rather than a job description, like you're a professor and this is what you do. A portfolio-based this is the work that we want you to do, which is different than a job. It's sort of a broader work. And so your job description might change, but your work.
And we just take a 5-minute break.
Your work is. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it very well, but it's a project and an area rather than a way of working. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Susan, I also see a comment from Pamela. It's been on the chat as well. Had there been provisions for joint authorship in collaborative and participatory doctoral research dissertations? Do you want to address the comment?
Yes, I mean, there always has been, especially in the sciences for decades, often parts of the dissertation are collaborative. So we're very familiar with that. What we do is in the preface, we require students to talk about any work that is collaborative, what their contribution was. As you might do in a paper that is collaborative, you would talk about what your contribution was. So that's the way we've been approaching that. I'm not sure if that was the precise question. But.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's been actually great to hear from you. I personally been very much excited to see what the latest development of GEEK's report and what you've done after that. It's a lot to reflect on as we move toward the post-normal logic and scholarly approach. With that, on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank you very much for your time. And